September 1943, rural France. The altitude is ground level, but the atmosphere is thick with the weight of unseen patrols and unspoken doom. The war does not always arrive with the roar of engines and the flash of guns. Sometimes it arrives in the absence of sound. It begins when the familiar rhythm of life, the distant chime of the church bell, the gossip in the marketplace, the clatter of a farmer's plow, is simply extinguished. This is the silence that descended upon the small, forgotten region near the Loire Valley in the autumn of 1943. A silence more terrifying than any artillery barrage, because it meant the occupiers were already there, watching, waiting. For Elise Moreau, a young woman defined by her quiet defiance and the memory of her brother taken years earlier, the silence became her only master. The official reason for her flight was simple. Her village, Saint-Aignan, had been marked for a razzia, a sweep designed to capture young laborers for the German factories, or worse, those suspected of harboring partisan sympathies. She had minutes, not hours, to vanish. Most fled to the woods, a chaotic, desperate surge easily tracked by the enemy's trained dogs and experienced patrols. Elise, guided by a peculiar mix of luck and calculated risk, chose the opposite direction. The decaying remnants of the Dubois farm, 3 kilometers outside the village boundary. Her sanctuary was Barn 17. It was not a hidden bunker, nor a reinforced cellar. It was instead a monument to agricultural neglect, a high-roofed structure of rotting wood, its doors hanging precariously on rusted hinges, its floor scattered with ancient, mouldering hay. It was precisely its pathetic lack of appeal, its utter poverty of shelter, that made it a perfect defense. Why would anyone search an empty husk? The German strategy was a cold, brutal logic based on maximizing effort. They hunted where the reward was highest. Barn 17 offered no reward. For 2 weeks, Elise lived in a world of dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light that pierced the eastern wall, and the constant, gnawing hunger that became a physical presence. Her provisions were meager, a few hard biscuits, a canteen of water drawn from a brackish stream, and a small, worn copy of Les Miserables. But her most critical tool was discipline. She permitted herself 2 movements a day, one to relieve herself in the pre-dawn mist, and one to check the sparse tripwires she had fashioned, scraps of twine and rusted metal tied to the main doors, auditory alarms against intrusion. Her world shrank to the size of a 6-meter square, dominated by the smell of decay and the thumping of her own heart. The narrative of war often focuses on the grand maneuvers, the tank formations, the decisive bombing raids. But the heart of the conflict lay in these tiny, isolated battles for survival. The irony of Elise's situation was profound. She had successfully escaped the organized, systematic terror of the Wehrmacht by retreating into a realm of utter insignificance. She was invisible because she was worthless, an historical contradiction that spoke volumes about the war machine's cold efficiency. What she could not know, what no intelligence report could have ever conveyed, was that this fragile geometry of solitude was about to be fractured not by a patrol, but by a single accidental point of light. A light that belonged to a man equally displaced by the chaos of war, an individual who carried his own history of violence and fear. Her isolation was a temporary shield. The war had merely paused at her doorstep, waiting for the precise moment to knock. The truth was simple. In occupied territory, there is no such thing as an abandoned place. And the deeper truth, the psychological edge of survival, was that the moment she saw him, she would have to decide if his discovery meant execution, or if it presented the only terrifying chance for an improbable survival. And if you are finding this story of precision and human endurance compelling, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our community of history enthusiasts. Your support allows us to continue bringing these forgotten narratives to light. October 1943, Barn 17, deep into the occupation. The silence had become heavy, not empty, signaling an imminent catastrophic change. Elise's existence was defined by her protocol of fear, a rigid set of rules formulated not by military doctrine but by raw instinct. Rule 1. Never move during daylight. Rule 2. Always sleep with her back to the main support beam, eyes oriented toward the doors. Rule 3. Rationing of water and hope must be equal. This protocol kept the creeping paralysis of fear at bay, substituting it with a dull routine of survival. Then, the routine shattered. It happened on the 16th day, late afternoon. Not a sound, not a crunch of boots, but the sudden absolute block of the single familiar sliver of light, the one she had calibrated her internal clock by. The door had not fully opened, but a shape, dark and heavy, was blocking the entry. Elise froze beneath the thick, dusty layer of hay, her breath catching in her throat, a physical constriction. The first realization was not that she was discovered, but that the intruder was alone. A German patrol moved with purpose, with the calculated clatter of equipment and the guttural commands of their language. This man moved differently. There was a subtle hesitation, a lack of momentum. When the man pushed the door open, the rusted hinges let out a sound like a high-pitched scream, a violation of the barn's silence. He was a Feldwebel, a sergeant. Not the young, aggressive type she'd heard about, but a man in his mid-30s, his face etched with weariness. The deep fatigue of a man who had seen too much of the Eastern Front, perhaps. He carried a standard-issue Mauser K98K rifle, but it was slung, not raised. The uniform was immaculate, the steel helmet slightly askew. He was not looking for her. He was looking for solitude. The sergeant, later known only in her mind as Helmut, entered the barn and stopped dead. He did not scan the room. His eyes went immediately to a corner, far from Elise's hiding spot, and he simply leaned his rifle against the wall, took off his helmet, and sat down on a broken wooden crate. He produced a tobacco pouch and a thin piece of paper, and began to roll a cigarette with the practiced, meticulous motion of a man whose only remaining comfort was ritual. This was the first great irony of the encounter. The German soldier did not come to inflict terror, but to escape it. The psychological pressure on Elise became unbearable. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat that seemed loud enough to summon the entire regiment. The sensory details became hyperacute. The metallic tang of the soldier's equipment, the faint smell of tobacco and rain-soaked wool, and the tiny, almost imperceptible sound of the cigarette paper being smoothed. Every second was a monumental decision. Move and die instantly. Stay and wait for the inevitable discovery when he inevitably stood up. In a historical context, the German military machine operated on the principle of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, demanding rigorous adherence to duty and a lack of emotional softness. Yet, here was an individual crack in the system. Helmut sat, smoked, and did not speak. His posture was not that of a hunter, but of a man attempting to simply forget his own name for 5 minutes. Elise had to read the situation through minute, barely perceptible signs. Was he a reconnaissance scout? A deserter? A simple sentry taking an unauthorized break? According to captured Wehrmacht documents from 1943, the morale on the Western Front was significantly higher than the crumbling Eastern Front, but small pockets of exhaustion and disillusionment were growing. The question that hung in the oppressive air of the barn was this: was Helmut merely tired, or was he fundamentally broken? A tired soldier follows orders. A broken soldier is unpredictable. After 5 minutes, an eternity measured in held breath, Helmut finished his cigarette. He sighed, a sound of monumental weariness. He stood up, placed the butt carefully under his heel, and retrieved his rifle. He did not look around. He did not check the hay. Then at the door, he stopped. He turned his head and his eyes, cold and blue, swept over the main support beam, the one Elise was using to orient herself. He looked directly at the spot, a fraction of an inch to the left of where she lay, and his expression did not change. It was a blank, military mask. He exited. The hinges screamed again. Elise did not move for another hour. She had survived, but the nature of her sanctuary had fundamentally changed. The barn was no longer empty, it was shared. And Helmut's direct, but deliberately non-committal gaze at the beam was an unspoken communication. I know you are here, and I chose, for now, not to see you. The psychological war had just begun, shifting from the terror of discovery to the paralyzing uncertainty of a known secret. Late October 1943, Barn 17. The air is now charged not with fear of the unknown, but with the suspense of mutual, unspoken acknowledgement. The unspoken acknowledgement changed the physics of Elise's world. Her enemy was no longer the vast, faceless Wehrmacht, but a single man, Helmut, whose motivations were inscrutable. She was operating in a dangerous new terrain, a known secret. If he had reported her presence, a patrol would have been there within the hour. The fact that they had not arrived meant he was maintaining his silence. But why? His visits became a pattern, a perverse routine of occupation. Every day between 16 and 17, Helmut would appear. He would enter, sit on the same crate, smoke exactly one cigarette, and leave. He never checked the hay. He never spoke. This routine, however, was a meticulously crafted psychological test. Elise, a student of human nature, honed by the desperation of survival, began to catalog his actions. He never looked at the same spot twice, scattering his gaze just enough to suggest indifference. Yet one day, she noticed a small, critical detail. A few days before, one of her tripwires, a tiny thread of twine, had been subtly disturbed by a rat. In the dead center of the floor, Helmut had placed a small, smooth pebble. It was directly above the slightly disturbed twine. It was a marker, a sign that he had noted her defense, acknowledged its presence, and was indicating that he saw the mechanism, not just the result. This wasn't a soldier. This was a strategist. Elise understood the communication. He knew her location was within the hay mound, and the pebble was his boundary. Cross this, and the game ends. The strategic implications were chilling. Why maintain this delicate equilibrium? Historians analyzing Axis morale in mid-war note the rise of micro-deserters, soldiers who, unable to defect entirely, carved out tiny, psychologically safe zones within their patrol routes. Helmut might have been using the barn not just for a smoke break, but as an escape from the relentless pressure of his own command. And Elise, the silent captive, was his unwitting alibi. Her survival validated his self-imposed momentary freedom from duty. But Elise could not rely on his psychological fatigue. She had to respond. The communication had to become two-way, maintaining the non-verbal dialogue. The next day, Elise waited until 03 hours, her designated time for the short excursion outside. She took a single dried sunflower seed, her last, most precious food item, and placed it on the wooden crate where Helmut sat. It was an offering, a reciprocal sign of awareness, and a profound statement of her own humanity beneath the terror. The following afternoon, Helmut arrived. He saw the sunflower seed. He sat down and carefully pushed it aside with his finger, not crushing it, but acknowledging its presence. He smoked his cigarette. When he stood to leave, however, the geometry of their exchange shifted again. On the crate, where the sunflower seed had been, he left a small, folded piece of paper. This broke the protocol. For Elise, the discovery was a thunderclap. The paper was not a threat. It was a carefully drawn map. A rudimentary sketch of the local patrol routes, showing the safe hours, the windows of time when she could potentially move. The routes were marked in precise professional lines. The irony was crushing. The German sergeant was not just tolerating her. He was actively, covertly, and lethally risking his life to aid her survival. This development presented Elise with a terrifying dilemma. The map was a gift, a lifeline, but it was also the ultimate test of trust. If she used it, she exposed herself to the external world, trading the static security of the barn for the dynamic, lethal risk of the roads. If she ignored it, she risked insulting her one protector, turning his benevolent silence into lethal betrayal. The high-stakes game of known secrets had morphed into a treacherous alliance, bound by nothing but two acts of non-verbal, radical trust. The question was no longer if she would be discovered, but what price she would have to pay to a man who had already given her more than any soldier should. November 1943. The first frost has arrived, bringing a new, penetrating cold that tests the limits of human endurance and technical ingenuity. The shift from individual survival to calculated action demanded a new mindset, moving Elise from the hunted to the strategic observer. The immediate concern was not simply food, but the engineering of survival against the elements and the increasing patrols. The German map, which she committed entirely to memory and then destroyed, provided a new matrix for existence. It revealed the truth about the enemy's Schwerpunkt, the center of gravity in the region. They were concerned with the river crossings and the main road. The abandoned farm was merely a low-priority tangent. This technical detail was key. It meant she could risk leaving the barn, but only at the precise moment of zero patrol. The 3-hour window between Oro 2 and 05 when the rotation of 2 key patrols overlapped in a vulnerable lull. The first foray outside, guided by Helmut's cryptic map, was an ordeal of sensory overload. The darkness was no longer a shield, but a treacherous, moving obstacle course. The details of her movement were tactical. She had to move with an altitude 0 crawl near the ground, minimizing the profile against the skyline, and she used the dry stone walls for acoustic dampening, a practice learned from the local resistance folklore. Her mission was resource acquisition, viewed through an engineer's lens. She was seeking not just sustenance, but thermal and caloric efficiency. In a destroyed farmhouse 2 kilometers away, she found what felt like a king's ransom. A small bag of potatoes, half-rotted but still viable for boiling, and, critically, a discarded tin of motor oil. The motor oil, specifically the thick, dark mineral oil used in agricultural machinery, was the key to her thermal survival. She needed fire, but fire meant smoke and light. Death. Her solution was an act of brutal efficiency, a smokeless lamp. Using a sardine tin, a scrap of wool fiber as a wick, and the viscous motor oil, she created a controlled combustion chamber. This lamp provided just enough heat to boil a cup of water or warm the potatoes without generating the telltale white smoke that could be seen for kilometers. It burned with a deep orange flame, emitting a scent of burned rubber and desperation. But it saved her life. This was the technological heart of her solitude. Meanwhile, the psychological theater with Helmut continued. His offerings became more substantive, but still within the silent contract. One day, a small, heavy piece of German-issue military chocolate appeared on the crate. The next week, it was a perfectly folded, clean bandage. These were not random acts of kindness. They were measured transfers of critical wartime material, calculated risks that confirmed his status as a strategic rogue. His personal history started to emerge, not through words, but through objects. On the crate one afternoon, instead of his usual tobacco pouch, lay a small, slightly tarnished photograph. It showed a woman, fair-haired and smiling, holding a small child. Helmut had left it, not as a gift, but as a silent request for understanding. This was the core of the psychological warfare. By sharing his vulnerability, he was not appealing for mercy. He was reinforcing the bond of their shared secrecy. "I am a man with a life," the photograph stated. "Do not betray me, because I am keeping the war away from you." Elise's response was crucial. She could not touch the photograph. That would be too intimate, too great a violation of the boundary. Instead, she left a tiny, meticulously carved wooden bird, a thrush, a symbol of rural freedom she desperately missed, on the edge of the crate. It was a communication of reciprocal humanity. The intelligence analysts of the Allied command often struggled to grasp the complexity of these human micro-alliances in occupied territories. The bond between Elise and Helmut was not political or romantic. It was a pure, volatile survival mechanism, an engineering of mutual necessity. It was a profound illustration of how the crushing weight of the war machine could sometimes be subverted by the desperate, silent contracts of 2 human beings on opposite sides of a lethal conflict. The engineering of survival was complete. Elise had thermal comfort, caloric intake, and a supply of clean bandages. But the price of this comfort was entanglement with her enemy, a dependency that felt increasingly like a tightening chain. The next step would be the most dangerous, exploiting the gift of the map for something larger than her own survival. December 1943. The French landscape is now a study in gray and brown, a visual metaphor for the moral landscape that Elise must navigate. Elise had achieved stasis. She was surviving, fed by the small acts of treason committed by Sergeant Helmut. But stasis was not freedom, and the moral weight of her situation began to crush her more than the cold or hunger. Her brother, a known activist, had been taken by the Germans. To accept aid from one of them felt like a profound betrayal of his memory and the resistance effort. The question was not if she should act, but how to translate her precarious position into a strategic advantage for the Allied cause. Her focus shifted from the tactical, food, warmth, to the strategic, information. Helmut's gifts of patrol routes and safe hours were a treasure trove of localized military intelligence. This information, if relayed, could save lives. However, the transmission was impossible. Her closest known contact in the resistance network, Madame Dubois, was 3 kilometers away, across open ground patrolled hourly. The problem became a calculus of treason, a deadly mathematical equation with only 2 variables, her own risk and the risk to Helmut. Any action taken against the German presence would inevitably trace back to the leak, and Helmut's execution would be swift and brutal, a fact Elise fully understood. The internal conflict was a mirror of the larger war, the demand for absolute loyalty versus the grey reality of human compromise. One evening, Elise realized the answer lay not in her movement, but in the soldier's routine. Helmut was meticulous about his 1 cigarette break. His movements were predictable, a fatal flaw in his own operational security. She developed a plan that required split-second timing and an intimate knowledge of his habits. It was based on the 10-second window. Helmut's routine included a brief moment, roughly 10 seconds, where he would be standing outside the barn, lighting his cigarette, before retreating to the crate. In this window, his rifle was leaned against the doorframe, momentarily unsecured, and his eyes were focused on the small flame of the match. The plan. Elise would emerge from the hay immediately after he entered, sprint to the door, secure the message to the rifle sling, and be back in the hay before he sat down and looked up. It was audacious, reckless, and based entirely on the hope that his exhaustion would keep him from noticing the minuscule disturbance of the air currents. The message itself was a tiny scrap of parchment, written with charcoal from her smokeless lamp. It contained 2 critical pieces of data from Helmut's map: the time of the weekly supply convoy and the identity of the local commandant's preferred route through the village. January 1944. The attempt. Elise felt the cold air hit her skin as she burst out of the hay. The timing was agonizingly tight. Helmut was inside, sitting down. She had miscalculated. She saw him on the crate, his eyes closed for a moment of peace. She froze. The scent of her unwashed body, the faint smell of motor oil and fear, must have been overwhelming. Helmut opened his eyes and looked directly at her. He did not shout. He did not reach for his pistol. He simply looked at the terror in her eyes, then down at the small piece of charcoal-stained parchment clutched in her hand. For a moment, the war stopped. It was a confrontation not between German and French, but between 2 broken individuals bound by a suicidal secret. Helmut then did the unthinkable. He stood up, slowly. He walked to her, took the parchment from her trembling hand, and read the 2 lines of charcoal script. His face, usually a mask of exhaustion, darkened with a flicker of something she couldn't identify. Fear, anger, or perhaps a profound sadness. He then walked to the barn door, opened it, and looked out across the field for a full minute, confirming the security of the area. He returned to Elise, who was now weeping silently, convinced of her immediate death. He did not speak a single word. He simply reached into his pocket, retrieved his personal field pencil, and added a 3rd line to her message. It was a specific grid coordinate, a more precise location for the convoy ambush. He handed the parchment back to her, returned to his crate, and resumed his smoke break as if nothing had happened. This was not a benevolent act. This was a declaration of shared destiny. Helmut had just committed an act of high treason, fully and consciously. He had validated her plan, enhanced the intelligence, and signed his own death warrant if the plan failed. Elise was no longer merely a refugee. She was now an operative, partnered with an enemy soldier who had, in that 10-second moment of shared silence, exchanged his loyalty to the Reich for his loyalty to a shared, improbable humanity. Late January 1944. The chill is now lethal. The landscape is frozen, and the stakes of the clandestine alliance are at their absolute peak. The intelligence was precise, enhanced by Helmut's final devastating contribution of the grid coordinate. The resistance cell, receiving the message via a series of dead drops orchestrated by Elise during her pre-dawn excursions, now covered by Helmut's meticulously updated patrol schedules, prepared for the ambush. This was no longer a question of survival. It was an act of war, leveraging the technological precision of the German machine against itself. The target was a key logistics convoy, designated Versorgungslieferung 77, carrying high-value replacement parts for Panther tanks and critical radio equipment. The ambush was to take place at the coordinates Helmut provided, a narrow, rocky defile known locally as the Jawbone Gap, a tactical bottleneck missed by Allied air intelligence but known intimately by local ground forces. The climax of the story relies on the accuracy of the intelligence and the unpredictability of the soldier. The day of the ambush was marked by an excruciating tension in Barn 17. Helmut arrived as usual, but his calm facade was fractured. He did not sit. He did not smoke. He stood rigidly near the door, his eyes fixed on the hay mound where Elise was hidden, and his hand rested constantly on the butt of his Mauser. His presence was not comforting. It was a physical manifestation of the impending disaster. In the mid-afternoon, the sounds of war finally shattered the rural silence. First, the deep, heavy rumble of trucks, the distinctive, low-frequency sound of the German Opel Blitz engines under load, grinding up the long approach to the gap. Then, the silence was ripped apart by the high-pitched, uneven crackle of automatic gunfire, the Sten guns and MP-40 submachine guns of the local Maquis. The sound of the ambush was unmistakable. It lasted exactly 7 minutes. 7 minutes of concentrated, horrific violence, the metallic scream of ricocheting bullets, the concussive boom of grenades, and finally, the colossal, shuddering explosion that signaled the destruction of the lead tank parts truck, the confirmation of success. Inside the barn, Elise and Helmut were locked in a silent tableau. When the sounds began, Elise felt a surge of triumph, immediately followed by the paralyzing terror of what she had done to the man standing a meter away. Helmut's reaction was the key to his character. He listened, not with fear, but with a horrifying detachment. As the final, earth-shaking explosion faded, he slowly drew a cigarette from his pouch, lit it, and took a deep, deliberate drag. He then looked at Elise's hiding place and whispered, for the first and only time, a single word in German. Gut. Good. The irony was complete. A German sergeant had just confirmed the success of an attack that utilized his treasonous intelligence, an attack that had certainly resulted in the deaths of his comrades. But the climax was not over. Helmut's mission was now one of pure self-preservation. The shattered convoy would generate a massive response, a tactical sweep of the entire region. His immediate presence in the area was now a liability. He walked to the crate, retrieved the last small piece of military bread he had brought, and placed it on the ground near the hay. He then took his rifle, shouldered it, and looked at Elise's hiding spot one last time. The forest will be full tonight. Do not stay. He spoke this time in heavily accented but clear French. Go south. Do not stop, and do not look back. He was ordering her to leave the sanctuary that his own treason had created. He had given her life, and now he was giving her freedom at the expense of his own survival. He stepped outside, pulled the door shut, and carefully placed a small bent SS rank insignia, a single silver lightning bolt, on the doorframe. The insignia was not his. It was a crude, brilliant piece of counterintelligence. It was designed to tell any subsequent patrol that the barn had already been searched and cleared by the Gestapo or SS, discouraging a cursory inspection by the regular Wehrmacht, buying Elise precious hours. Helmut then walked away from the barn, not toward his barracks, but in the opposite direction, toward the direction of the ambush and the incoming German response. He was walking into the fire, a self-sacrifice to maintain the illusion of his own innocence and secure Elise's escape. February 1944. The landscape is fractured by snow and the psychological debris of the convoy attack. Elise is on the run, leaving Barn 17 behind. The ambush was a success, strategically validated by official resistance reports. Versorgungslieferung 77 was listed as a total loss, crippling the local German maintenance capabilities for weeks and boosting the morale of the local Maquis immeasurably. But for Elise, the success was tainted by the fate of the man who made it possible. She followed Helmut's final command: "Go south, do not stop, and do not look back." Her journey became a relentless, solitary march, an epic of simple human endurance. She relied on the skills honed in Bahn 17, silent movement, thermal efficiency, and psychological discipline. She moved only at night, using the terrain and the residual knowledge from Helmut's maps to avoid the inevitable retaliatory sweeps. The psychological impact of the encounter was permanent. Elise was no longer just a victim or a refugee. She was a witness to an act of moral complexity that defied the simple black and white narratives of the war. She carried two things with her: the bitter memory of her brother and the chilling, beautiful memory of Helmut's single whispered word, gut. The legacy of the sergeant remains a footnote in the grand history of the war, a ghost in the archives. Did he survive the post-ambush sweep? There is no historical consensus. The records of the local German garrison showed an increased number of missing or executed soldiers in the following weeks, often marked with the vague entry, "fallen in action, enemy action," or "deserted." It is a near certainty that Helmut, by walking toward the center of the conflict, was either killed in a staged act of resistance to cover his treason, or simply executed as an alleged collaborator. His sacrifice achieved its purpose. The SS insignia on the barn door bought Elise the time she needed. She eventually made contact with a more robust resistance network in the south, using the specificity of her intelligence, the exact composition of the convoy, and the names of local Feldwebel as her credentials. She became a vital link, a source of hyperlocal intelligence that baffled the Abwehr analysts. They could not understand how the French resistance was obtaining such detailed, tactical information on low-level movements. The irony of the situation continued to reverberate. The core of the successful resistance operation was built on the treason of a dedicated enemy soldier, a man whose personal fatigue with the ideology of Nazism transcended his military oath. Perspectives and testimonials, based on historical archetypes. General de Brigade Michel Lambert, French Resistance, 1960. Interview. The intelligence we received in early 44, it was different. It was too precise, not guesswork. It was the movement of specific men, specific vehicles, not just positions. It told us the rhythm of the enemy heart. It was a gift of extraordinary risk. We benefited greatly, but we always knew whoever gave us that gift paid the ultimate price. Oberstleutnant Klaus Richter, Wehrmacht commander, post-war interrogation. The loss of Versorgungslieferung 77 was a strategic disaster. It was not the quantity of the ambush, but the precise placement. They knew the jawbone gap. Only a fool would have used that information. It indicated a level of betrayal within the lower ranks, a psychological rot we were beginning to see in the West. But we never found the source. Elise's story is the story of the human element in a war of machines. She was not a trained spy, nor a saboteur. She was simply a person who, when given the choice between death and moral complexity, chose the latter. Her legacy is one of silent resilience, a triumph of psychological warfare over brute force. She emerged from the war a survivor, but forever marked by the terrible geometry of Bahn 17, where the lines between friend and enemy were blurred by a shared, desperate need for humanity. Spring 1945. The war in Europe is ending. Elise returns to the region, seeking the final piece of the puzzle. The official end of the war arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, gradual withdrawal of the German forces. Elise, having served the resistance until the final liberation of France, returned to the Loire Valley not to celebrate, but to close the only chapter that truly haunted her, the fate of Bahn 17 and Sergeant Helmut. The farm was still there, a ghost in the spring sun. Bahn 17 looked exactly as she had left it: rotting wood, tilted doors, a structure entirely neglected by the violence of the war. She entered cautiously. The smell of dust and old hay was overwhelming. The first thing she noticed was the absence of the SS insignia. It had been removed, likely by the German rearguard or perhaps by a local farmer. The crate was still there, and on the crate she found the last, most profound message. It was not a map, nor a piece of chocolate. It was the small, intricately carved wooden thrush, the one she had left on the crate months earlier as her silent reply to his photograph. It was placed carefully in the center of the crate, a symbol of their shared, impossible bond. But beneath it, etched crudely into the wood of the crate, was a final inscription. Not in German, but in French. À l'amitié que nous n'avons jamais prononcée. To the friendship we never spoke. The act of carving this message, slowly, deliberately, in the language of the enemy, and at the risk of his life, was Helmut's final testament. It confirmed that he had returned to the barn after the ambush, after his final directive to her, knowing his time was limited. He had closed the chapter, securing her last memory of him, not as a soldier, but as a man. The enduring historical lesson of Barn 17 is this: the technology of war, the tanks, the rifles, the radio intelligence, is terrifyingly effective, but the human capacity for contradiction, for quiet rebellion, is the single most unpredictable variable. Elise and Helmut's encounter was a profound illustration of the psychological war, a duel fought not with bullets, but with silent glances, pebbles, and tiny treasonous pieces of paper. They found a shared humanity in the most inhumane of conflicts. The legacy of the sergeant is a whisper against the roar of history. He may have died, but his act ensured that a piece of vital resistance intelligence survived, and that Elise Moreau lived to tell the story. He successfully hid his ultimate act of defiance within the vast, cold statistics of the war machine. Elise never spoke of the sergeant or the barn to the resistance leadership. It was her secret, her ultimate burden of survival. She understood that the truth was too complex, too dangerous, for the official history of heroes and villains. Her story is a reminder that in every great, sweeping historical drama, there are countless small rooms, dusty barns, and isolated moments where the war's official script is rewritten by two people, bound by fear, trust, and the terrifying, beautiful realization that even in the darkest corners of human conflict, the final act of defiance is often an act of simple, quiet kindness. This is the kind of intricate human drama that defines a high-quality historical narrative. If you would like to explore another aspect of the war, perhaps the technological development of the planes that fought overhead, or the strategy behind the coastal defenses, please let me know. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history.